Do you want to know something that's always really stood out to me about underground hip hop in comparison to every other genre of music? The idea of having a collective. Because on its face, it's kind of a weird concept when you really think about it. Because to many, the entire appeal of being a rapper, and especially an underground rapper, is about being able to do it on your own, producing your own beats, recording your own vocals in your room, and if you're really talented, even making your own videos. I mean, that's something that you really can't do with many other genres of music. If you want to make rock, well, you're gonna have to start your own band, somebody to play drums, guitar, and even if you're talented enough to lay vocals and play an instrument at the same time, you're still gonna need a couple people to back you up. And you can say the same thing for genres like country, pop, and even really jazz. I mean, we do have a couple white guys with guitar who have managed to make it pretty far, but the barrier for entry is still a lot higher than it is for hip hop. I mean, we're truly living in a golden age where any random kid in their bedroom can find a beat on YouTube, record some vocals into a shitty mic, and there you go, they have a song. Will it be good? Well, results may vary, but you can still do it. But what if you don't want to do everything on your own? What if you like the idea of making solo music and not having to depend on anybody, but also having a group of people who can help you if you need them? And that's where the idea of the underground collective comes together. I mean, in concept, it makes a lot of sense. You get a bunch of rappers who already have somewhat of an audience, but not a big enough one to sell out shows, and then you put them all together in one group, and bam, you got a built-in audience. But this type of thing very rarely ever seems to work out. I mean, there's been a bunch of collectives in hip hop that have gotten to a certain point and gotten their name out there in a big way, but once they really start to break through into the mainstream, all of a sudden everything falls apart. And the reasoning behind that 9 times out of 10 usually comes down to ego. Either ego or mismanagement. Because when you first start off making music, you really have nothing to lose. You're not making any money off of it yet, you have no fan base, no brand, but once you start to get a little bit bigger, you start to worry about the people you're surrounding yourself with. What if they say something that gets me in trouble? What if they decide to take things in a bad direction and we all get screwed over? Or probably most prominent of all, what if that motherfucker gets bigger than me? I'm the one who started this collective. I'm the face. I'm the star. You are not allowed to get bigger. And if you do, well, you used me to get where you were. You never would have got there without me. And that's a story that we've seen over and over and over again. So how do we avoid that from happening? Well, we have to look at some of the most prominent underground collectives that never really ended up falling apart. And I think one of the best to look at would be Sesh Hollow Waterboys. An underground collective that really seems like it never should have made it all that far. I mean, you got Bones, who was so quiet and closed off, never really talks publicly. Then you got Chris Travis, which is pretty well the same. Then you got Xavier Wolf, who is a complete crash out and always talking shit. And you would think that all these personalities would end up clashing and they would fall out. But the reason that that never ended up happening until 2019, but we'll talk about that later, is because they had their 4th member, Eddy Baker. And in my opinion, Eddy Baker may actually be the most important member of Sesh Hollow Waterboys, which I know is an absolutely crazy claim to make, as to many people in the fan base, Eddy is really looked at as the weakest link, the one who never really had bangers on the level of the other 3, and honestly, dead weight. But let me tell you, that is not the case, and in fact, the group would have never made it to where they are nowadays if it wasn't for Eddy. Not convinced? Well, let me try to change your mind when we look into the story of Eddy Baker. Jamal Marquise Ashby was born August 18, 1991 in Pomona, California, spending the first 4 years of his life living there with his mother and father. However, this time would be pretty short-lived, as his father was actually heavily involved in the streets, being a full-on blood member since long before Eddy was born, and eventually having all of that catch up to him. With him getting locked up when Eddy was only around 4 years old, and spending the better part of a decade behind bars. And obviously, that type of chaos and instability in their home life is going to lead any kid to start to lash out. And Eddy would definitely start to do so, getting kicked out of school after school all throughout his childhood. With him often getting into fights, vandalizing bathrooms, setting things on fire, basically your classic bad kid sort of stuff. And it would get to the point that his mother couldn't handle it anymore. So similarly to Will Smith and Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, he got in one little fight and his mom got scared and she sent him to Kentucky. Sorry, it wasn't Bel-Air. And instead of living with his auntie and uncle, instead he was living with his father, who recently got got out of prison. Now, I'm not really sure why his mother thought it was a good idea to send her troubled kid to live with his gang member father, but it seems like that's what she wanted to do, and surprisingly, things got a lot better. No, but for real, they actually got a lot worse. Because as soon as he ended up getting to Kentucky, he would immediately enroll in military school. And while you would think that would help to straighten him out and put him on a better path, you gotta keep in mind that most of the kids that are in military school are there because they're misbehaving. So if you take an already troubled kid and put them in that sort of environment, they're probably only gonna start to lash out more. And on top of that, Eddy would start to get introduced to gang members as well. And surprisingly, he actually didn't meet them through his father. Instead, he would often spend time hanging out on the side of the street and trying to meet people, and well, he ended up meeting some gang members. And once he did, they would immediately put him on. And what do I mean by that? Was he doing drills? Did he get jumped into the gang? Was he killing people? No, but he was selling crack around the age of 14. Yeah, selling crack at 14. Definitely a better path for him. A tale that would truly bring a tear to So Smula's eye. Honestly, the two of them got to collab together and make a track called Crack Flippin' for Kindergartners. That would go hard. But anyways, getting back to Eddy, you would think with him selling drugs at such a young age that it wouldn't be long before he became a full-on member of the Bloods. But surprisingly, Eddy wasn't actually all that interested in becoming a gang member. Instead, being a lot more fascinated by the mafia, watching a bunch of movies on the subject, including Godfather and Goodfellas, and wanting to become a member himself. Which of course he couldn't really do because I mean he's in Kentucky and I don't think there's any form of mafia in Kentucky. But despite that, I mean Eddy didn't know any better. He was 14 years old and he truly believed that if he kept his nose clean and stayed away from the Bloods, he might get accepted into the mafia. So for all those parents out there that are worried that their kid might end up joining a gang, all you gotta do is sit them down and show them Goodfellas and immediately they'll be back on the right path. Trust me, it will definitely work. If it doesn't, well, don't blame me, blame Eddy Baker, okay? Anyways. Although to be perfectly fair, it's not exactly like Eddy was on a righteous path. I mean, he was still selling drugs, he was getting into fights, the same old shit that was going on back in California. So eventually, his dad realized that nothing was getting better and decided to send him back to Ontario. California to be specific. Yeah, this entire time I was sitting here thinking that Eddy was actually Canadian and thinking that that was really cool, but no, he actually was living in a town called Ontario that's in California. Damn Americans, always stealing shit from Canada. We gave you guys Drake, and this is the thanks that we get for it. Honestly, ungrateful. And as soon as Eddy ended up getting back to Ontario, he would immediately get in trouble again. This time getting kicked out of 2 more high schools before eventually having to go to continuation school and graduating a year late when he was 19 years old. And at this point, he was left thinking, what am I gonna do with the rest of my life? I mean, I'm not in Kentucky anymore, so my entire network of drug deals is no longer really an option. The mafia never really got back to me, so I guess that's not gonna happen. What am I gonna do? So just like any lost teenager who doesn't know what they want to do with the rest of their life, but also doesn't want to work at McDonald's, he decided to get a job at UPS. Which funnily enough is also where Xavier Wolf was working when his career really started to take off. It's kind of like poetry, it rhymes. But of course, even at the time, Eddy was a pretty big boy. It was a lot of work to move all these boxes around at UPS, and he didn't want to do that for the rest of his life. So he had no choice but to pick up the pen and start dropping bars. But he actually didn't end up doing that right away. Instead, he wanted to be a Hollywood agent that would help movie stars get booked for different movies. I mean, it made a lot of sense at the time considering the fact that he didn't live all that far away from Hollywood and he had a massive love for movies from the 80s and 90s, so it makes sense that he would want to be part of that world. Although, when you're a random 19-year-old working at UPS, it's kinda hard to find clients. So instead, he would say, fuck it, you know what? I do like movies, but I also really love hip-hop, and I have a couple buddies from high school who are trying to be big-time rappers, so why don't I try to manage them? But of course, they ended up being lazy bums who didn't want to do anything, so he said, fuck it, I'll do it myself. I'll become a rapper, being heavily inspired by many West Coast legends like Tupac, Eazy-E, Snoop Dogg, basically all the big names that you can think about. And just like with his love of movies, he was actually a bit of a scholar when it came to hip-hop, being so invested in the genre that he knew how certain rappers moved, the way that they rose to fame, and he he was hoping that he could reproduce that for himself. Although, with Eddy being a little bit older than his contemporaries at the time, he kinda had an outdated mindset when it came to the rap game. He thought that all he had to do was make a hot mixtape, get it popping in the local scene, and then eventually it would get on the radio, get picked up by a label, and bam, famous. But by this point in 2011, the rap game was really starting to change, with the internet becoming a lot more popular and widespread, and many new artists using that to their advantage. And while at the time Eddy definitely was a pretty big fan of people like Soulja Boy and especially Lil B, he kinda looked at them differently than most of the younger generation, seeing them as cool rappers who were definitely doing their thing, but not really understanding that he could replicate that for himself. So instead, he decided to move down to LA in hopes of making connections with different people in the industry and eventually breaking his way through, taking on the name of Eddy Baker, which was basically shorthand for Edible Baker, which was a reference to, well, weed. As at the time, Eddy was smoking a lot of weed. He would end up going down to Fairfax and spending a lot of time there, eventually making connections, although not to people who were actually prominent within the rap game, and instead, well, a bunch of random people who hang out on Fairfax. But it just so happens that he would end up meeting somebody who had a connection to another artist going by the name of Space Ghost Perp. Now, I know this doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, as after all, Perp was in Florida and Eddy was in California, but with the internet, they were able to get connected. Now, during this time in 2010, Eddy didn't really have any released publicly available music yet, instead going from open mic to open mic all over California in hopes that he would run into an agent or get noticed by another rapper, or really anything that could help him to further his career, and surprisingly, it would actually happen, because he ended up going to an open mic, rapping bass style, which once again, that's how Lil B raps, and somebody would record it and post it on Twitter. And with Space Ghost Perp being a massive fan of Lil B and seeing this video on his Twitter timeline, he decided to reach out to Eddy Baker. Now, real quick before we get into it, I don't think I need to explain who Space Ghost Perp is again. All you need to know is that he was a very prominent rapper in the early 2010s. He was one of the biggest names in the early Florida underground, and during this period of time, he had a very popping Twitter. Now, during this period of time, he hadn't formed Raider Clan yet and was really only rapping alongside his cousins. He hadn't even met ASAP Mob and was pretty well only known within Florida and on Twitter. But despite him not being the biggest rapper in the world yet, he definitely had a lot more of an audience than Eddy Baker, and with him seeing a lot of potential in Baker, he decided to reach out. With Perp going on to repost Eddy's first ever official mixtape, which was called The Bakery, and apparently at the time it actually did pretty well, although in the modern day, it unfortunately seems to be completely lost to history. The only thing we really have from it is the cover art of Eddy eating cake, and really nothing else. Also, if you look on Genius, it will tell you that the project was released in 2012, but I was actually able to find a very old article from 2011 where they were talking about Eddy Baker, a recent music video that he put out, and plans to release the Bakery EP in late 2011, which makes a lot more sense when it comes to the Raider Clan timeline, because basically the group got started in 2009 with Space Ghost Perp and his two cousins. In 2010, he then started to take more members from the internet, with Eddy Baker actually being the second ever person to join Raider Clan. And considering the group was basically at their peak during 2012, it makes a lot more sense that he ended up joining around 2010. And it was through this connection to Perp that he would make many more, with Black Cray going on to join the group soon after, becoming part of the very short-lived Raider Clan skate team. He was also able to get connected to different people from ASAP Mob, because Eddy and Perp actually knew each other before Perp even ended up going to New York to hang out with them, so those were some pretty big time connections. On top of that, he met Denzel Curry, and of course, most importantly, Xavier Wolf and Chris Travis. With there being a planned show in 2012 where Raider Clan was actually supposed to open up for Soulja Boy, but unfortunately, Perp being Perp, he ended up having a falling out with Soulja Boy, and it never ended up happening. But despite that, Xavier Wolf and Chris Travis already had plans to come and stay with Eddy, so they decided to go through with it. And once they got there, they loved LA so much that they wanted to stay long term. So Eddy, being the good guy that he was, decided to invite them to live with him. Although the only issue is that he was living with his mom at the time, and he didn't even warn her that two of his friends from the internet were coming over to stay long term. But luckily for him, she was actually pretty chill with it, and they were never really there anyways, often taking bus rides to LA so they could do what they needed to do musically, and really only coming back to Ontario for a couple hours at a time to take a shower and get some clean clothes. Which of course meant that the three of them would get much closer together than any other member of Raider Clan, as after all, they were so spread out all over the country, with Perp and Denzel Curry and Young Simi all being in Florida, and then Amber London being over in New York. Or maybe she was actually in Texas at the time, or it could have been Tennessee. It's kind of hard to keep up because during this point in 2012, there was so many members of the clan that not even Perp could keep track of all of them. But despite all the little issues that would start to happen within the grander Raider Clan collective, when it came to Eddy, Xavier, and Chris, they were doing pretty well. As during this period, both Chris and Xavier already had a pretty solid body of work under their belts, with Xavier having the Wolf game Rudolph, which was a pretty popular project in the early Raider Clan days, and Chris having Codeine and Pizza, which at the time was one of the most popping underground tapes of that year. And while Eddy wasn't really able to create anything on the level of those projects, he would put out his Edible mixtape, which was pretty solid, had some features from both Chris and Xavier, and did pretty well for the time. On top of that, he would also get a couple tracks on Raider Clan Volume 1. Once again, I know that's not what the project is called, but the name is way too long and convoluted, and honestly, they should have called it Raider Clan Volume 1. But despite the boys starting to get some attention online, they weren't really making any money. I mean, they would get to perform at the Boiler Room from time to time, but they would only make around $10 to $5, as after all the Raider Clan members would go to those, and they had to split the money like 8 different ways. On top of that, SoundCloud wasn't really a thing yet. None of them had their music on iTunes. Bandcamp was a place where you could make some money, but people really had to like your music to want to buy it on there. So really, the only opportunity to actually monetize their work was to go on a tour, and luckily for them, by 2013, Raider Clan was planning to go on a tour. But Eddy Baker actually didn't end up going on it. Apparently during the time he was busy in New York or something, or maybe he didn't feel like it was all that worth it. Although the biggest highlight of the entire tour was them performing at Coachella, which was originally only supposed to be a Space Ghost Perp set, but he decided to bring out the entire Raider Clan. Or at least that's what he wanted to do, but unfortunately, like I said, at this point the group was so big that they had like 40 members, and Coachella was not going to let them put that many people on stage, so Perp would have to pick and choose different people to come with them. And this would cause a lot of friction within the group because certain members felt like they were getting special treatment and other people weren't allowed to go to the big time shows, and eventually all of this would boil over and the group would start to fall apart. As soon after Coachella, a rumor would start to circulate between members of the group that Denzel Curry was actually planning to leave, and after Xavier Wolf and Chris Travis caught wind of that, they would immediately hop on Twitter and tell the world that they were no longer Raider Clan. And of course, with his two best friends in the group deciding to leave, Eddy Baker would go along with them, although there was never really any bad blood between him and Perp. At least not any that I've seen. I mean, when they all initially left, Perp wasn't all that mad, but as the years went on, he would get more frustrated with people like Chris and Xavier. But when it came to Eddy, they always appeared to be on good terms, which is a common trend that you'll see all throughout Eddy's career. He never really seems to get into issues with other artists. If he does, he ends up fighting them and then it's over, and he doesn't really like to carry on with online beef, which is both a positive and a negative, but for right now, it was definitely a positive, as after all, he was able to keep that Space Ghost Perp cosign while continuing to work with his two best friends. And on top of that, they had also managed to meet another person who was an affiliate of Raider Clan, going by the name of The Kid, but better known as Bones. Basically, he was a videographer at the time who shot a couple different videos for Space Ghost Perp. Perp definitely fucked with Bones, but he never really wanted him to be a full-on member of Raider Clan. Similarly to people like Fat, Nick, and Puya, they were more so affiliates that would work with people in the group, but never became full-on members. But it seems like during the time that they were all working together, Bones was able to form a pretty good connection with Xavier Wolf, and considering that Bones and his older brother Elliot actually had their own place in LA, they were all able to connect together in real life, and eventually they would form a group. Now I've explained this before, but I'll explain it again. Sesh Hollow Water Boys is a combination of 4 different groups. Team Sesh by Bones, which basically doesn't have any other members and is more so a merch line. Xavier Wolf has Hollow Squad, which once again isn't really a group. I believe I Don't Know Jeffrey is part of it, but it's more so a brand similar to Team Sesh. Chris Travis would create Water Boys because after he put out Codeine and Pizza, he was afraid that his fans were going to be sipping too much lean, and he wanted to convince them to try to be healthier and sip water. And initially, Eddy Baker was actually going to become a member of Water Boys, but Chris would tell him it's a lot better of an idea to create your own brand, so he ended up creating Healthy Boys, which was basically a play on the fact that him him and his homie Chili Sosa, who were the two founders of the group, were a bit overweight. Initially, the plan was to call themselves Healthy Boys because it would inspire them to start to lose weight, but unfortunately that never really ended up happening. But despite that, they would keep the name, and while it didn't end up working out for them, it would help a bunch of their fans to get in shape. So in the long run, they definitely made the right choice. And on top of that, unlike the other three groups, which were basically only collectives in name alone, Healthy Boys was a real deal rap collective, which was mainly comprised of people that Eddy had met in LA during his time living there. And while none of them really went on to get all that popular, it still goes to show that Eddy was a lot more outgoing than the other members of the group. However, despite that, during this period of time, apparently Eddy actually was trying to take a bit of a step back from music, instead once again wanting to be a manager for Chris, Xavier, and Bones. But considering the fact that all of them were hanging out together on a daily basis, it only made sense for him to make music with them as well. However, this is where you start to see some of the issues with Eddy Baker's career, as after all, Chris Travis is a black guy who makes music for weird white kids, Xavier Wolf is a black guy who makes music for crash out white kids, Bones is a creepy white guy who makes music for creepy white kids, and Eddy Baker is a black guy who makes music for the streets, which doesn't really fit in with the whole Sesh Hollow Waterboys group. And because of that, as their fan base continued to grow, Eddy Baker would start to stand out more and more, with many people hoping that he would try to change his style of rap to appeal more to the white kids who listened to him. But Eddy was already pretty stuck in his ways, and because of that, he would continue to make the same type of music for the next 5 to 7 years. Despite that though, it's not like he was doing poorly, because of course Xavier Wolf would manage to get that connection to SoundCloud, get everybody in the group put onto the partner program, and because of that, they could start to make money. On top of that, the group would start to perform at different venues all over California, going on to do ham shows in front of pretty big audiences, and while they weren't really getting paid the best to perform at a lot of these places, even doing a couple of them for free, they were able to sell their merch to the audience, and that's where they would make a good majority of their money, selling a sweatshirt for like $40 and selling about 20 to 30 a night, which, if you do the math, is a pretty good chunk of money. Now, you would think there'd be quite a bit of competition between the members, as after all, Bones was selling his own stuff, and Xavier was selling Hollow Squad merch, and then you had Waterboys merch with Chris Travis, and then Eddy Baker was selling Healthy Boys merch. But despite that, at the time, they all had their own dedicated fan base that was willing to buy different pieces of merch from different members at the same time. It was only later on that Team Sesh would become massive, and Hollow Squad would become massive with Car Guys. Around this time, Eddy would end up dropping his next mixtape called Enduro Baker, which honestly didn't really push the needle all that much when it came to his own success, as all the other members at this point were already really starting to take off. But despite that, it was a solid project, and the fans who liked him also enjoyed it. However, I don't want to make it seem like Eddy had no hits of his own at the time, because he would end up putting out a couple music videos in late 2013 on his personal YouTube channel, which were called Stand Still, and most importantly, Nino Brown, which is still one of his most popular songs even to this day. If you're somebody who really doesn't like Eddy Baker and consider him dead weight when it comes to the collective as a whole, you should definitely check out Nino Brown, because honestly, it's still extremely catchy even to this day, and there's a reason why it's so popular. Soon after that song came out, he would go on to drop a project called Private Sessions, which included an incredibly rare song called Drip, which actually had all 4 members of Sesh Hollow Waterboys on it, which is something that you rarely, if ever, saw. The song itself is okay. I mean, it's not the best song ever made, but it's really cool to see all 4 members come together to make a song. Soon after that, Sesh Hollow Waterboys would get even bigger, with them starting to do full-on tours all over California, with NetR being their touring DJ at the time. If you don't know who that is, he's the guy who made the beat for Beamer Boy. And while groups like ASAP Mob and Odd Future were starting to gain kind of a bad reputation for charging venues way too much for a single performance, Team Sesh was gaining a good reputation for, once again, doing some shows for free, and when they did ask to get paid, they really didn't ask for that much, as once again, the merch was really doing the bulk of the heavy lifting. It was also around this time that Eddy realized the more music that he put out on SoundCloud, the more money he was going to make, so he ended up putting out a pretty impressive 9 entire projects during 2014, with the 2 most prominent being Criminal Minds, which was a collaboration project with another artist from Memphis going by the name of Black Smurf, as well as American Cream, which was a collaboration project with And you can really look at Eddie Baker in 2014 from two different lenses because, on one hand, putting out that much music is definitely watering down your sound and making it so fans don't really have to wait that long in between projects, which is a good thing in a way, but at the same time, they can't really get excited for new music when you're constantly dropping new music. Or you could look at it through the lens of Eddie Baker was finally starting to make it, he was making good money, and why wouldn't he capitalize on that? And honestly, that's more the mindset that I'm in. I mean, if you're doing something and it's working for you, why not do it more? I mean, you already had Chris and Bones doing the whole mysterious, I'm too rare to show up in public type of thing, so Eddie might as well have his fun and drop all the music he wanted to drop, and he definitely did. It was also around this time that Xavier Wolf would start to BMX all over the neighborhood, eventually getting to meet another pretty prominent BMXer going by the name of Adam22, who at the time had a very small podcast called On the Come Up. Now, during this period of time, he was really only interviewing BMXers, but after getting to know Xavier Wolf, he decided to ask him, hey, do you want to do an interview? And well, he did it, and it did well. And after Xavier was on the podcast, he would then get Puya and Fat Nick, which would then lead to Black Cray, and eventually in the following year, 2015, Eddie Baker would also hop on the podcast. And like I've said many times before, 2015 really wasn't the most popping year when it came to No Jumper, meaning that Eddie didn't really gain a whole lot more buzz by going on the podcast. However, I do think this podcast would help him out in a big way because it exposed his fans to his personality. And while people can shit on his music all they want, you really can't shit on him as a person because he's really funny, he's super charismatic, and I might be glazing, but I don't give a fuck. It's cool to see a rapper who's actually comfortable with themselves while not being cocky. It seems like everybody in the underground nowadays is either antisocial, weird as fuck, and don't want to show their face whatsoever, or a cocky prick who doesn't want to talk to anybody because they feel like they're at the top of the world. Whereas Eddie Baker is simply a chill dude, which is really what we need nowadays. Also, only like 3 months later, No Jumper ended up interviewing Suicide Boys, which was really the first time that the channel got a lot of attention, and considering that Eddie's interview wasn't that much farther back, he probably got a big spike from that as well. When it came to the music side of things, Eddie didn't slow down all that much, putting out 5 entire mixtapes, which really aren't all that worth mentioning. It's more of the same. He had a couple features from different members of the group, but besides people in Sesh Hollow Water Boys, and maybe a rare Black Smurf or Fat Nick feature, Eddie was basically making a bunch of solo music, which once again was screaming pretty well, but he was nowhere near as big as the other members of the group. However, here's the thing. By 2016, people like Xavier Wolf were starting to feel like old news. There was an entirely new generation of rappers coming into the game, which were making Sesh Hollow Water Boys feel like they were no longer relevant. However, seeing as how Eddie never really was that big within the group, it meant that he had a lot more room to really experiment and get his name out there more, as people were saying, hey, I'm sick of Xavier Wolf, I've been hearing the same old music for the past 3 years, but with Eddie Baker they were saying, hey, he's trying something new, that's actually pretty interesting. One was willing to accept the new age and one wasn't. And I know that's kind of weird to say when it comes to Xavier Wolf because he did do a feature with Lil Peep after all, so it's not like he was completely against the newer generation, it was more so that he would pick and choose, and that kind of hurt him in the long run. However, during this period of time, the two of them were basically doing side quests, as they would go on to meet up with Fat Nick when he was on tour with Lil Peep and Smoke Perp, which of course formed that connection between the two of them, and Eddie Baker would even go on to create a song with Lil Peep. The song is called Doubt Me, and honestly, it's by no means the best Lil Peep feature ever, but it is cool to see that Peep ended up working with a couple different members from Sesh Hollow Water Boys, as after all, before he even started rapping, he was a massive fan of Bones, and probably wanted to get a feature with him as well. Unfortunately, we're never really gonna know what went down between the two of them. Apparently, Peep and Bones didn't really like each other, if you can believe Too Poor, because she would go on to say on a No Jumper interview that Peep wouldn't allow her to listen to Bones. But if you talk to anybody who knew Peep from back in the day, they would tell you that he absolutely loved Bones and his music, so she might be lying and trying to start shit. I don't really know, but either way, he never got the Bones feature. But I mean, hey, Eddie Baker is a pretty good consolation prize, right? Right? No? Well, whatever. On top of that, Mr. Baker also managed to make a connection with the Suicide Boys, with him appearing on their project Dark Side of the Clouds on the track Golden Calf, which featured both him and Fat Nick. So he was definitely making some pretty solid connections, and while his style of music wasn't really changing all that much, it seems like he was starting to get bigger than he was before, which is pretty rare for people from the early underground. I mean, a lot of these guys were massive from like 2012 to 2015, kind of disappeared for 2016 and 2017, started to come back in 2018, and then got massive after 2020. But Eddy Baker's career trajectory was a little bit different. Soon after he got those two features, he would go on to drop his own solo project called Less Than Zero and another one called Made, which once again didn't really push the needle all that much. But one thing that definitely would get them attention was the entire group going on to do a very rare interview with Kinda Neat, which is something that once again you never really saw from them. And this was really the beginning of them moving away from the whole mysterious I don't want to talk persona into being more of a public group, which I definitely appreciate. I mean, I get it, it's cool that they're rare and we don't know everything about them, but at the same time, if we know nothing about them, then eventually people are going to forget about them and they won't really have a long-lasting legacy, which is part of the reason I do these videos. But anyways, moving on. Not long after that, Eddy would go on to get an interview on Ham on Everything alongside Booty Chain, which if you remember from my Black Crave video, if you haven't watched it, you definitely should. And also go watch every video I've ever made. That's actually Black Crave's long-term girlfriend. On this interview, Eddy would go on to talk about Raider Klan, his time with them, as well as actually giving Space Ghost Perp his props, which was very rare for the time, as pretty well everybody was on the hate train for him. I mean, look at any early No Jumper podcast and 90% of it is going to be talking shit about Space Ghost Perp, which I'm not saying is undeserved, but it does get a little bit tiresome. And this is what I mean when I say I think Eddy and Perp are still on good terms. I mean, this interview took place in 2017, so it is possible that they fell out in the following years, but at the time, they definitely were on good terms, going to show that Eddy had no bad blood with pretty well anyone. Soon after that interview, he would go on to put out another project called From Drug Dealer to Rockstar, which in my opinion is one of his best albums to date because he really tried to experiment and worked with people that you would never expect, like Thousand Band Fawny, which goes to show back in 2017 the Cardi side of the underground and the emo rap side of the underground were actually willing to work together. I don't know when things got so divided, but honestly, we got to get back to that. Stop hating on the Cardi clones. I know a lot of them are corny and way too similar to each other, but have you seen some of the people in the modern day dark underground? A lot of those people are also copycats and 100 times more corny than anything Cardi has ever done. I'm sorry, I'm on your guys' side when it comes to this, but we gotta admit that we're not any better than them. But hey, that's only the opinion of an underground grifter who wasn't around in 2011 to see Raider Klan in its heyday because I was fucking 10 years old, but hey, you know what? I'm grifting, so my opinion doesn't matter. After that, in December, he would go on to drop a project called Healthy Boys, which had a feature from Little Tracy on the track Tying My Shoes. Once again, not the best song that Tracy ever made, but pretty unique when it comes to Eddy Baker's discography. Soon after that, in 2018, he would go on to do a collab project with Omen 13, which was called Super Hot, and he even got the chance to appear on a Nardwuar interview. To be fair, the interview was for Bones, but Eddy Baker was able to get on camera, which is kind of interesting when you think about it, because Xavier Wolf was able to get on a Nardwuar interview through Space Ghost Perp, meaning the only member of the group to never meet Nardwuar is actually Chris Travis, which is honestly a great disservice to the entire underground. I really need to see that happen. Please Nardwuar, please Chris Travis. Soon after that, he would put out a project called Vigilante, which actually had a feature from Bones' older brother, Elliot. I mean, he wasn't rapping, it was mostly him talking, but still, pretty cool. Now, I would say unlike many other members of the group who really started to peak around 2015, I would say Eddy Baker's best year ever in the rap game was definitely 2019, because not only would the group start to do a lot of media coverage, but he would also start to really experiment with his sound and make some very unique music that a lot of fans really appreciated. With him starting off the year by putting out a collab project with Bones called Sparrows Creek, which is still probably his biggest project to date, with some of the songs being his most streamed on Spotify, which is kind of sad in a way because it means that Eddy never really got that big breakthrough project that put him on and was still kind of in the shadow of Bones, but at the same time, he knew how to play his role, and a highly streamed song is a highly streamed song no matter who you're working with. Which is not an excuse to work with terrible people, let me put that out there because people are going to misconstrue what I said. A highly streamed song is a highly streamed song as long as it's not with somebody who likes children a little bit too much, if you get what I mean. And soon after that project came out, the entire group would go on to appear on a Montreality interview, which was really cool to see, as at the time we hadn't seen an entire group interview for about 2 to 3 years. Although unfortunately, this is where things really started to fall apart, as Xavier Wolf and Chris Travis would start heavily beefing on Twitter, and eventually Chris would announce that he was leaving the group altogether. And while that was definitely very sad to see, I don't think the group would have ever even made it as far as they did if it wasn't for Eddy Baker. I mean, Xavier Wolf was always a little bit nuts, Chris Travis always had a bit of a big ego, and Bones definitely wasn't the type of guy that could really deal with conflict, which meant that Eddy Baker often had to step in as the group's mediator, being outspoken enough to get through to people while also not being overly aggressive like other people in the group. And while unfortunately, eventually tensions would get too high for Eddy to be able to bring everybody back together again, he was able to keep them together for the better part of half a decade, so honestly, you gotta give him props for that one. I mean, think of all the timeless music that we probably never would have gotten if it wasn't for Eddy Baker. You may hate on the sound, you might think that he's not as good as the other members, but you have to admit he was important to the overall group because without him, there would be no group. However, despite the group finally starting to break apart in mid-2019, Eddy wouldn't stop making music, with him going on to put out a project in April called Wicked, which in my opinion is one of his best projects to date. He ended up working with this producer named Young Cortex, who is pretty well known for working with Peep and being one of the producers who made Witchblades, although to be fair, he was only co-producer on that one, so it's hard to give him full credit, but either way, you have to give him a little bit of props. And not only was he the primary producer on the entire project, but he actually ended up putting down some vocals on a couple different tracks as well, with one of them being called They Want Me Dead, going on to get a music video on Trash AMV, and honestly, fire song. A lot of people speculate that Eddy really only made this project because he was trying harder to appeal to his white fans, and honestly, that might be true, but who cares because it worked. I'm a white fan and I love this shit. A trap metal Eddy Baker is something that I never knew I needed, but it's definitely something that I'm glad is here. And Eddy wouldn't stop experimenting there because he would go on to drop a project called I Got High and Forgot I Recorded These Songs, with one of them featuring Chapo, which once again is a very good song. But honestly, after the work that he did with Young Cortex and Chapo, he kind of went back to the same old thing, which at this point, people kind of expected. And things would really only start to change in 2020 once the pandemic broke out, leaving Eddy unable to go and perform at shows, which of course took out a pretty good chunk of his revenue. I mean, he was kind of chilling at this point because he definitely made a good amount of money over the course of his entire career, but at the same time, being locked inside all the time and not being able to perform when you love being a performer is kind of shitty. But unlike a lot of artists who simply sat around and got depressed, he would actually go on to start a podcast with Chili Sosa, which was called the Blunt Talk Podcast. And while it's not the most entertaining thing I've ever seen, I think it did have a lot of promise. I mean, like I said before, Eddy Baker is very charismatic, he's super funny, and I think if he was able to get the right guest on the podcast, he would probably have something special. But unfortunately, it seems like he completely gave up on it once the pandemic was through. And from there, it was more of the same. He would go on to do a song with YNJ, which is pretty crazy. If you don't know who that is, that's the Coochie Man. If you haven't listened to any of his music, well, I'm not going to spoil it for you. Definitely go check it out. It's a unique experience to say the least. In 2023, he went on to do a project with I Don't Know Jeffrey, as well as another collaboration project with Bones called Jones Peak, which once again is pretty good and are some of his most streamed songs even to this day. And then finally in 2025, as you already probably know, him and the entire Sesh Hollow Waterboys group ended up performing at Grey Day, which was an amazing moment, despite the fact that Xavier has horrible allegations, but we won't bring that up because it makes people really mad. But you know what? Despite that one caveat, it is kind of cool to see all of them together again, putting their issues to the side to finally perform as a full-on group for all the fans that have loved them for all these years. And once again, this probably never would have happened if it wasn't for Eddy Baker. Do you really think think that Xavier and Chris would have ever squashed the beef if it wasn't for Eddie Baker bringing them together, and also a giant pile of money, which obviously was a pretty good incentive as well. But hey, it happened. It's cool to see. It's cool to see that the Suicide Boys are showing respect to Sesh Hollow Water Boys. It's cool to see that Eddie was able to have a pretty successful career despite never really fitting in with the rest of the group. It's cool to see that he never really made a ton of enemies or scammed people or did anything horrible. He's just overall a cool guy who ended up getting in the right place at the right time, and because of that, he was able to be successful. And with that said, shout out to Eddie Baker. If Sesh Hollow Water Boys was the Beatles, he would definitely be Ringo, but hey, he's still a member of the Beatles, so that counts for something, right? But anyways, with all of that said, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. I hope you learned something. If you liked the video, make sure to subscribe to the channel. We're trying to get to 32K. Leave a comment letting me know who you want to see next. And yes, I do see the comments saying that you guys want a longer Bones video. That could happen before the end of the year. I also see Ruben Slick, but honestly, that's going to be a pretty tough one to put together. So if you guys really want it, I'm going to need this video to hit 50K. And if it doesn't happen, don't worry about it. I still will do it eventually. But if this video goes crazy, I'll do it like right away. Sorry boys, a man's gotta eat, and if you want to see it, you gotta prove it. But if you don't want me to have to worry about views and all of that shit to keep myself alive, why don't you head over to my Patreon, give me $1 a month, you get to vote on polls, see videos a day early, and get a shout out at the end of the video. Pretty cool stuff. Knife gang, delete this game, sandwich gang, everything gang, 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 gang. Peace the fuck out.